Now we turn to the administrative system with a paper by Magda Bianco and Giulio Napolitano. The subtitle of the paper has a question mark, a source of competitive advantage, or disadvantage, what is it? Disadvantage, yes. Me. I understand that the author suggests that the answer is not as immediate as it could seem if we look at the long-run records. I think could be a nice point to discuss. Thank you. Go on.
Thank you very much. Yes, the answer is not so obvious, but we will work mainly on the disadvantage part, in fact. So this is the outline that we will follow in the presentation. So the first point is why the administrative system. Well, it's pretty obvious, I guess. By now it's widely recognized that institutions matter for growth and that a good government, more specifically, is essential to either ensure provision of public goods and regulate or produce those that are characterized by market failures. And both effectiveness and efficiency in this process contributes in a relevant way to the competitiveness of an economy. Again, to explain why the administrative system, the second part is that the current perception of our administrative system is certainly very negative, and it is that the government, the administration, in a wide sense, is today an excessive burden for the productive system. Here we take a number of indicators built, these are built by the World Bank in the Governance Matters project, and they all go in the same direction of suggesting that the Italian position is very bad in the international comparison, both if you look at government effectiveness, regulatory quality, rule of law, control of corruption. But even if we consider other indicators such as the doing business indicators or other indicators built by Laporte and Schleifer on government efficiency, or if we consider the OECD product market regulation, they all go in the same direction. Of course, these indicators receive strong criticisms because of the methodological limitations in their construction. So we also consider some measures of output of the administrative system, a very limited number of measures of output. As example, one is on the right-hand side, the length of civil procedures as an example of a basic output of an administrative system, one of the basic public goods that an administrative system should produce. And we take as a measure of efficiency or inefficiency of this production the length of civil procedures, which show a very strong worsening over time in Italy. On the left-hand side, the investments in infrastructure, which again shows in the last decades a strong reduction in terms of GDP. Of course, we could take other indicators like those referring to health or to education, which over time have shown great improvements in Italy, but they are subject to some qualifications, some of which we heard actually in some presentations yesterday concerning education, for example. So high growth, but in terms of international comparisons here as well, we're probably not doing so well. So from these and actually other sources, we have a picture of an administrative system that is currently a burden for the productive system, and in a sense it has not been able to perform adequately its role of provider of public goods or regulator of market failures, even if in certain periods, of course, it has been able to provide substantial support to a growing economic system. And here we have sort of forced a sort of periodization of the evolution of the administrative system, even suggesting periods where it has been a sort of negative burden for the system and periods where, in fact, it has accompanied the growth of the system, but is really a sort of forced scheme. What we aim to do is certainly not providing a coherent, a complete framework for the interpretation of the behavior, for the evolution of the administrative system. Other much better equipped than us have done this, like Guido Melis or Sabino Cassese, and also because it's very difficult to construct data sets, a long time series of data sets on these issues. We basically offer some tentative explanations without aiming at being exhaustive, basically concentrating on the weaknesses. So we won't explain most of the best performance of the system, and it's a very preliminary work. Now, again, somehow forcing the interpretation, we suggest at least three possible weaknesses of the initial evolution of the system. The first is that Italy was a latecomer in this area. The second is the links with politics. The third is the role of the legal culture. Here the first point is that compared to other countries, a missing strong administrative tradition represented an initial, even if obviously not an absolute disadvantage, that is a disadvantage that might have been compensated afterwards. Contrary to other European states where administrative systems were already established in the past, Italy is a latecomer. As Germany, the administrative system is born in the second half of the 19th century. Contrary to Germany, which had anyway a Prussian administrative tradition, Italy did not have a strong bureaucracy and a well-established administrative culture. For a number of reasons, the French model was a sort of most natural choice, but a number of differences made this transplant not very efficient. In a sense, a very centralized system was imposed to an extremely differentiated set of areas, and the process of ensuring uniformity of the administrative system was slow and difficult to perform. The second source of possible initial inefficiency was the political influence of politics over bureaucracy. Here the claim is that the excessive political influence over the administration did not allow the creation of an autonomous and competent bureaucracy, as was the case in other continental countries. Well, obviously, the tension between politics and administration is an intrinsic tension in any administrative system. The idea here is that it was not solved in a very efficient way. A major component of a mature administrative state is a stable bureaucracy regulated on the basis of a merit system. In Italy, what happened was that early on there was a very strong relationship between politics and top-level administration, basically an identification and almost overlapping. Only at the beginning of the 20th century, the legal state of civil servants was formally defined, and the exchange between administration and politics was basically one way. There was no exchange from the administration to politics. And in a sense, this produced, when the formal definition of legal status of civil servants was defined, a sort of reaction of politicians trying to discipline, to regulate administration as an instrument to discipline a bureaucracy that was becoming separated. On the other hand, the bureaucracy sort of using this discipline, which was growing, as a form of protection against politics. The third factor that we consider relevant is the role of the legal culture. Here the somehow again forced thesis is that the relevance of a mainly southern legal culture and the role played by lawyers in the public administration was in a sense an obstacle to the development of an approach more oriented also to the needs of a productive system, a growing productive system. In the first period, actually, the administration had a number of well-capable and high-level technicians, engineers, scientists, but we already observe at the end of the first decades of the 20th century that basically at the top level of the administration, there were basically only or mainly lawyers, employees graduated in law. And this somehow discouraged the technicians, engineers, and so on, to the best ones to enter the public administration, and created a sort of distinction between, and also geographical separation between a public administration where mainly southern, according to some interpretation, and lawyers worked, and a productive system which was based on mainly northern, more technical elites where they were working. This in a country where there was a growing number of lawyers as graduated from universities. Actually, they graduated in law were the highest in percentage, the highest numbers in Italy for a very, very long time, and a large share of lawyers in parliament. This is just one number. It's very difficult to have information of this. Just one number referred to the 1950s. And if you look at the pink data, this is, well, Group A means the high level of the administration. And you see that 36% of the top level administration was made of graduated in law. The third element of the legal culture was basically the administrative law. Here, the development of a legalistic and formalistic approach to the whole administrative action with strong academic work by famous administrative lawyers like Vittorio Emanuele Orlando made legitimacy that is consistency with the regulation more relevant than the production of actual services or goods. And then further factors referring to multiple ex-ante controls by various agencies and the possibility of litigation from private actors increased these sort of inefficiencies of the administrative culture. These, among others, we believe, were possible factors of initial inefficiencies, induced weaknesses, and a somehow legalistic approach, not always oriented to the quality of the services to be produced. One of the services that an administrative system, we believe, should produce is actually civil justice, one of the basic public goods that a government and administrative system should provide. We consider it an example and, well, a particularly interesting one, not only because it's a basic public good, it's one where legal discipline plays a relevant role, where actually differences across the country, geographical differences might be present and play a role. And here the interactions between the design of the public administration, its rules, and the behavior of private agents might be particularly relevant. What we do, we consider just one performance indicator, one very rough performance indicator, but which is commonly used actually, which is the length of proceedings and its evolution over time, and try to look for possible sources of the increased inefficiency that we observe. Litigation, resources, availability of resources, the procedure driving the trials. Well, the very rough estimator for the efficiency of civil justice, the length of procedure, shows over time a strong worsening in all courts, in those where small claims are disputed, like uffici di conciliazione, but also in those where higher, more important claims like pretura and then tribunali are discussed, and then courts of appeals as well. This worsening is particularly strong after the Second World War, so there seems to be a sort of break after that. It is certainly true that there are differences across the country. Here we distinguish across areas, and you see that islands and south show a worse performance over time, even if the distance is not really increasing. The worsening concerns the whole country, but at different levels across country, with possibly strong initial effects of the differences here. We only compare across countries the length of proceedings in 1912 and 1971, and even if not too many data are available, we do observe a sort of correlation between the two. So differences that were present at the beginning of the century are those that are still present in the 1970s. Now, searching for reasons, as I said, we look for some possible reasons behind this worsening. One is litigation. Do we observe an increase in litigation over time? Well, actually, if we compare to what was there before the war, litigation has reduced over time, but it's basically small claims litigation, uffici di conciliazione, where actually the disputes were reconciled in an oral system in a sort of efficient way. What do we observe actually after the war is an increased litigation in tribunali where especially higher claims are discussed. Again, searching for reasons for this possible increase in litigation, role of attorneys, of lawyers. Well, since the beginning, since the unity, actually, in Italy there was a higher number of lawyers than in other countries compared to the population, and this number was higher in the south. And already in the 20s there were complaints that lawyers were actually trying to lengthen artificially trials so that they may have been behind an artificial increase of litigation and an artificial increase on length. But actually the most intense growth of the number of lawyers has been in the last 20 years. Costs, difficult to have data on this. Some data available, but only for the period after the war, show that they are actually relatively low, especially for high-value disputes. So costs might not have been an obstacle to an increased litigation. Quality, here a very rough proxy of quality, appeal rates and reversal rates in appeal. This again, if it's very low, might induce higher litigation. If you expect that, the quality is not very good and that you can reverse your result in court, you would tend to go not only to the first instance but also to the appeal. And this has been growing actually over time, an increased appeal rates after the war and very high reversal rates arriving to 40%, and hence suggesting that that it's a bit like tossing a coin going to court. You really don't know in advance how it will go afterwards. This, in a sense, suggests a combination of the inefficiency of the system, including, in a sense, the performance of judges in terms of judging from quality, and, of course, the behavior of private agents. No obvious break, actually, after the war, except for the quality in terms of appeal rates. And a system that, in a sense, did not discourage access to justice through costs, which were kept relatively low over time, but through excessive length, with distortions that, well, in terms of costs, of course, you don't discourage different income, different wealth access to court, but if you have excessive length, you might favor wrong parties to resist in court and create distortions for the whole system. Second possible source of malfunctioning, resources and their organization. Here the thesis is that as a whole, it does not seem that the number of judges and their allocation across the country was responsible. Over time, judges increased, even if, as we saw, the number of claims, of overall claims, did not increase that much. Their allocation across the country was most favoring the South, where judges per inhabitants were higher, even if the South was, in a sense, already inefficient. What also the Judges' Council, that is the Consiglio Superiore della Magistratura, was claiming in the 60s was that they were observing a reduction in a very rough measure of productivity of judges over time, with a higher productivity in the North than in the South, and they were suggesting that this was possibly due to an inefficient distribution of courts and of judges. We might claim that possibly also incentives for judges were possibly not the best, with the reform after the Constitution giving a lot of autonomy on the one hand, but limited responsibility on the other. And then, of course, procedures. The role of procedural rules has probably been very strong. Formalism, rigidity has characterized procedures in Italy in a very strong way. Reforms in this field have basically failed due to mainly the opposition of the agents involved, lawyers especially. So basically, we still have a very formal and very rigid procedure, which might account for a strong, for a relevant part of the inefficiencies. So as a whole, we have a major public good which has been ensured only in a reasonable way only until the last decades, and then inefficiencies possibly associated to administration, organization, incentives, and rules, and on the other, to the opportunistic behavior of some private agents have prevailed. What we do next is to suggest that to these initial weaknesses, and possibly, of course, other factors that we are not able to consider, again, forcing somehow the interpretation, we might suggest that the system reacted in a way that in some cases has produced reasonable answers or answers that have been adequate for the periods, in other less efficiently, but even these initial efficient answers have then transformed in possible further sources of dysfunctions. So the first is what we call the growth outside the formal public administration, to the growing formality, administrative regulation, employment discipline in the public sector. There was a rise of public bodies of so-called parallel administrations, which somehow represented a corrective device to the growing dysfunctions of the formal administrations. This is just the graph of the total number of this administration created, where actually groups are considered as one unit, so that, for example, IRI, which is one of the major examples of parallel administrations, is counted as one. So if we counted single companies, it would be a huge growth. They were created actually since the early 20th century and had a significant growth in the fascist period, but continued to grow afterwards. Major example, as I said, IRI or Casa per il Mezzogiorno, but of course there is a huge number. Main advantages, again, forcing and simplifying a lot, flexibility in organization, somehow personnel management outside the discipline of formal public administration, which allow the presence of strong technical competencies and, in a sense, an extraordinary approach to some public policies. This allowed to support a growing economic system, but in the long run, in a sense, reduced incentives to reform and strengthen the formal part of the public administration, induced a legislative reaction in terms of extending the public law discipline also to anti-paralleli slowly, which assimilated slowly them to the formal public administration and implied a diffusion of the bad practices of public administration also to anti-paralleli, growth in employment, political patronage, and so on. Here, just one example of growth in employment in one subset, which is aziende autonome. Second response of the system to some already present inefficiencies, what we call excessive regulation. In a sense, also as a response to a limited enforcement capacity, we observe a tendency of regulating excessively and in a detailed way many areas of the economic activity. Here, the thesis is one made by Schleifer that in the absence or in the limited capacity of contract enforcement in a system, you tend to have more and more detailed regulation of economic activities. On the other hand, this might have been due to the self-protection of public administration to increasing legal formalism on the one hand, and on the other hand, the political trial to sort of limit this administrative discretion. So in a sense, the two sides were using, the same instrument which was producing growing dysfunctions. Here we would like to have detailed data on regulation of different administrative areas and economic activities. We are building this, but it's very difficult to have it for 150 years. Here just give you a very summary picture of the number of laws, of any type of laws issued every year. And here, well, the flows of laws is very high over time in any year. If you consider the stock, of course, you would see an enormous growth, given that not a great activity of eliminating laws that were not more applicable was performed. Here we construct another very, very rough indicator of complexity of law, which is the average number of pages per law, which shows in the last decades a worsening that, well, we all know with the use and abuse of the legislative instrument to discipline in a very detailed, opaque, and unstable way economic activity. And here is an international comparison showing how Italy in 2006 was compared to other major countries. The third possible bad, well, not response, but basically consequence for the administrative system is administrative corruption. Here it's very difficult to have data. Corruption is very difficult to measure, basically due to underreporting, but it's common view that it has become a substantial issue, especially after the 70s, due to some of the weaknesses that we have discussed, due also to the decentralization of powers that was happening over time, with local administrative structures possibly more exposed to the possibilities of corruption due to weaker technical competence and other reasons. But also, as I said, for the other reasons that we discussed, and of course the role of organized crime in some areas. Here just one data for the last few years, which is the international evaluation of how in Italy works the control of corruption, and we see a worsening in the last decade. The same picture would be provided by the other data on perception of corruption, like those from Transparency International. All these reactions, in a sense, we believe induced inefficiencies and produced a strong burden for the productive system. Starting from the 70s, the system tried to react with tentative substantial reforms, as was done also in other countries, of course. Even very substantial ones, and here we list some of the most important ones, were in cases also formally implemented with legislation and introduction of new rules, but met substantial resistance from the public administration itself and from the system. Here, the idea is probably, given the history that we have described and the sources of difficulties and inefficiencies, you probably need a very strong convergence of political will, but also a substantial convergence of administrative elites to be able to intervene in a substantial way in this area. Finally, we want to conclude with some caveats that we believe are very important. There are a number of factors that we are certain important and we have not considered. Geographical differences. We are very conscious that there are in the country many differences with high-performance local administrations and worse ones. There are a number of other relevant factors that certainly played a role impacting the performance of public administration, social capital, the role of crime, or better, organized crime. And of course, we have not developed a lot the fact that the administrative system, although rather inefficient as a whole, has allowed a significant growth, so it must have had also some positive, efficient aspect that we know were there. The question is whether today the administrative system, as we described it, is really much less efficient than in the past, or whether in the current context actually the need for a well-working, a formal, well-working institution is more relevant for competitiveness. That is, it's not anymore possible to find alternative ways out as was done in the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I can start by saying that this is a very interesting paper, and it contains a fresco of the evolution of the administrative system in Italy with a lot of data that were never assembled before, at least to my knowledge. And so it's an important document that will encourage more research on this area of the evolution of the Italian administrative system since the unification, with emphasis on a few indicators. The paper starts with international comparisons, reporting studies done by others, World Bank and other institutions, for aggregate indexes of institutional efficiencies. Then there is cross-regional information, more specifically on civil justice indicators. And these are the main findings. I'm not going through all the points that you see because the paper was very detailed, but in a nutshell, there is a discussion of initial conditions at unification, of the drivers of the observed evolution, the reaction to the historical legacy that has been documented, and more findings. It is also documented the fact that there is geographical differentiation across different areas within the country, and there is also an attempt to document reforms, attempted reforms at least. So this is what the paper is about. And I'm going to play a bit the devil's advocate. I'm going to take very seriously the question marks at the end of the title, a source of competitive disadvantage. The paper does not contain a full-fledged empirical investigation, not at this stage, but there is a pervasive belief that you read from the first few lines of the paper that this state of the administrative system must have mattered for growth because institutions matter for growth. Is this true? This is what I'm going to question. This is what's going to lead my discussion. So I'm going to start my comments with this background motivation, which is very present when you read the paper, about the link, the existence of a link, a causation actually, between institution and growth, which is taken for granted. But actually, with even at the very aggregate level in recent work on the causes of growth and income levels, there is a heated debate, there is a horse race which has been played with institutions on the one side and at least two other competing explanations of the deep determinants of growth, human capital and geography, right? So is institutional inefficiency, and more specifically what this paper looks about, administrative inefficiency, really the main driver of Italian economic development? Geography, one of the other competing explanation, is not likely to play a big role, not a big role, even if there is a difference, at least if you look just at latitude, right, between the north and the south, there could be something there, mountainous also. But what probably should be taken more seriously as a competing explanation is the relevance, the potential relevance of human capital, when the term of comparison is Western Europe or the countries that are now at a developed level. However, what I'm suggesting that it is difficult to establish that this kind of institution affect growth comes from a deeper thinking done by many people about what institutions are. It can actually be very difficult to distinguish even between the single two sets of institutions that I've just mentioned, the administrative institution dealt with in this paper and human capital, since their evolution tend to be intertwined, and this is a theme that is actually present in the paper, and it is very true, especially in the case of Italy. Think of the role played by law school, which is discussed in the paper and has been reported in the presentation, and the role played by lawyers for the development of the administrative system in Italy. Actually, the author seemed to suggest that the presence of a large number of lawyers, especially in the South, sort of produce some peculiar features of the system, as if there were these lawyers out there that decided to occupy the system and take it over. More along the same line, actually, this could be the reverse. It could be that people took law because there were gains precisely in the way the administrative system was built, such to make that a rational choice. Actually, this reminds me of a debate in post-colonial Africa. People were asking why so many people take law degrees rather than going to agricultural colleges when what is needed in Africa, because the rents to be captured were in the bureaucracy, and this may be a little bit the same story for Italy. There may be links not only with the educational system and with human capital accumulation and the way it was shaped, but also with other kinds of institutions, labor market institutions. The fact that the South experienced what it did in terms of the administrative system development may be due to the fact that the local labor market was not able to absorb the educated labor force, and more generally this is true for the South and the North as well. This development may have to do with the fact that the labor market in general was never a labor market that rewarded merit. It did reward seniority rather than merit. Culture institution also matter. The small role played by technicians after the initial phase mirrors once again the organization of the educational system. This is a theme that reappeared in many of the presentations today and yesterday, the role of the classical tradition at the core of elite formation in Italy, the tradition from Croce and its role. Actually, if you listen to some of the speeches by Steve Jobs, there is a rehabilitation of the humanities. This should be said. To conclude this first part of the discussion, even if we were persuaded that institutions rule, this is what Acemoglu would tell you, even if we were persuaded of the primacy of institutions, can we unbundle them? I have mentioned at least 2 or 3 sets of institutions, which is very hard to distinguish. And even if this paper is very detailed in describing one specific facet of the institutional story, these interconnections are always present in the data and in the discussion. So this was general comments about the general motivation. Of course, I'm not saying that institutions don't matter since we don't know what they do. Of course they matter. I'm not even saying that they are good in Italy. They are not, and this is well documented. I'm starting to suggest that they may be so because they are not efficient in the sense they don't maximize growth. I tend to accept that, even if we cannot prove it yet. But they may be efficient in some other ways. They may be maximizing something else, rent, for example, right? So what a theoretical framework can tell us as a first guide before we actually tackle the empirical analysis, which with this wealth of data could be done much better than with previous data at the aggregate level as provided by the World Bank, which were the first step. So theoretical frameworks to address this question. What do I have to say? There are a couple of papers by Beasley and Persson that model state formation with a focus which is close enough. Every paper is different than the other. The data are always different, the model are always different. This is close because there is a focus on legal and also fiscal capacity of the state. And the model shows very quickly that there are the state capacity, including the quality of the administrative system, is facilitated under a set of conditions. If the country is richer, I'm going to go very fast, if there is a common interest, public goods, and typically war, an external war plays this role, but also the desire to build welfare states, political stability, inclusiveness in the political institutions, so parliamentary democracy rather than presidential is more conducive to state capacity, even if we don't have time to think of how Italy is playing in each of these respects, right? We can, think of many of the things that happened in these 150 years and place them in this, parsimonious framework. What is the conclusion? State capacity guarantees strong states and is also associated with growth, but associated is not causing growth necessarily. There is a co-determination, a co-evolution predicted by this model. So there is no, attempt, no ability, in fact, no possibility perhaps to establish causation in that model. There is also a small empirical test of the model in the same paper. But and there are some proxies, interesting proxies selected to account for the main factor that I've listed before. again, the historical incidents of war, parliamentary democracy, legal origins of the German and Scandinavian tradition, and so on. There is no attempt to control for reverse causality, but some correlations, are exhibited by the authors along the line that I have discussed. So there is a model which is close enough, but it's not what will guarantee us, a path to establish causality, because there is no causality in the model. There are other models. As I was mentioning before, what is efficiency about? We can maximize things that are not growth or income, right? And this is perhaps the line of research within which Acemoglu, Ticchi, and Vindigni have contributed. They focus on the political role of state bureaucracy, and they show how inefficient states can emerge and also persist based on patronage politics. I don't have to say very much. Everybody that read the paper knows what it means in the contents of Italy and knows that this is a very powerful model to help us understand what is going on in Italy, nothing to do with growth. Just a little more detail on this line of research, the rich elite can use patronage policies to capture democratic policies with the goal, reduce the redistribution, right? So this is a model of state building which is, basically nothing to do with growth or income maximization. I'm going to accelerate because I don't know how much time is left. Let's go to the empirical assessment. As is explained in the paper, there are some empirical studies at very aggregate levels of the impact on growth on similar indicators. Here we have new data that we could use, and perhaps we can learn more about the puzzle, right? The question mark that is posed at the beginning in the subtitle. So empirical assessment of these specific kinds of institutions, what could be done with the new data, we can exploit the geographic dimension. There is a rich variety within Italy, right? And develop ultimately, the paper is already extremely dense. I'm not suggesting that this could be a revision of this paper, obviously, right? This is a research program for the future, for other people perhaps. But, to go beyond what we already know, I can think of at least two possible frameworks. Work in order to stress differences within macro regions within Italy, the pre-unitary states. We have some information, and compare them with analogous regions within Europe. This is something that Tabellini has done to exploit the role of culture, for example. Or even more, we can differentiate within Italy between the cities or provinces. Some of the data, right, are available at that level of disaggregation, so this work could be done. So, and one more suggestion for the regressor, these were the, how to, frame the investigation. Rather than to proximate causes of inefficiency, we can look at these deep determinants, such as, if we compare across European macro regions, different versions of common versus civil law tradition, or if we focus on Italian cities and provinces, there could be different levels of trust. I'm saying this because even if there is obviously a problem of endogeneity and reverse causality, there are also ways to control with that with instrument. And this, with a bit of luck and a lot of imagination, we can think of this instrument and many more. Examples, how much time? 1 minute, okay. There are a few scattered examples. Let me, if we want to look at initial condition more deeply, there is this paper by Dincecco, Federici, and Vindigni that digs into something that has to do with fiscal capacity and therefore administration in pre-unitary states of Italy, and about instrumentation strategy that I just alluded to. Guiso with co-author Sapienza and Zingales do compare across Italian cities and use instruments and work on trust, which I've suggested very quickly before, with imaginative instruments that I listed here. Even if we were able to set up the empirical investigation that I think we could do, there are further warnings, right? Interaction matters. So there is a first example of the role of historical legacies for current outcome, always cast in terms of institutional differentiation. A paper by Becker and co-author find that the legacy of the Habsburg Empire is important in a linear way, and now I'm going to understand why I'm saying linear, for current economic outcomes of a variety of kind. But, example 2, there is another recent paper by 2 authors that compare the demand for litigation, so something that we could perhaps replicate with this data, in 2 different parts of the same country, Romania, and which was previously part under the Ottoman and part under the Habsburg Empire. What do they find? That the effect of this institution on economic outcomes changes sign depending not only on the part of Romania where you are, but also on other factors. So there are important interactions between the legacy of the past and socioeconomic characteristic of the region, the level of income, very simply. So the impact of institution is hard to capture, also because it could be non-linear, also because it needs to be unbundled among different sets of institutions. I'm going to stop. Okay.
Any comment or question?
Okay, thank you. Let me first congratulate with the authors. I'm not a particular high-standing source, but still let me express my admiration for the work they have done. I would like to propose you a pretty much down-to-earth further explanation for your advocated inefficiency of the administrative system in Italy. And I take one of the most impressive indicators that you produced, which is the length of procedures, which you showed that actually building on a number of your previous work, you show that there is a run-up which goes back into the foundation of Italy, and the length of the procedures have been steadily on the rise. So my point is the following. Normally when, if it's true that, you know, as you said, the the ratio of litigation, the litigation rate, so to say, has been sort of steady, but obviously given the growth of the population, the absolute number of cases which have been put forward must have increased, and this resulted in an increase of the length of the procedure. So there must be a queue building up, and a queue in market analysis it's meant for rationing. So there must be a capacity constraint. That's my very down-to-earth suggestion over there. But you explained that this capacity constraint can't stem from the personnel, because judges have been recruited in flocks. I mean, they've been there is a larger number of judges. Also, clerical works are. Clerical employees are going up, and you show the graph on that. So what is the missing factor? It could be very easily that the missing factor is the infrastructure. That's my basic point. And this should be all the more true in a market, in quotes, where there is no price. There is no price clearance. There is no clearance. So there must be a capacity constraint. That might be an explanation. So I wonder whether you can, build up a long index of infrastructure. I know this must be a challenging job. I don't know, you should look for the old times equivalent of ICT, typewritings, machines or whatever, and that might, remove some variance in your explanation. Thank you.
Well, I don't have many reactions, meaning that I take Well, the suggestions of Graziella well, we are really grateful for the suggestions for future research and for putting the results into the best context, meaning that we shouldn't consider this as well, we shouldn't take for granted first the relationship between institution and growth, and take into account that this is one institution that a lot of links with other Italian institutions. Labor market, well, certainly human capital is one and a very important one, and these reverse links with the legal culture and the role of the educational system is very interesting. The link with the labor market is very interesting as well. We know that actually the public administration was sort of used as a social instrument to solve partially the labor market problem in the South. So keeping into account the relationship with different institutional aspects is extremely important. For the future research, as I said, they are all very interesting leads, so we will certainly try to explore what we can. Just an answer to Piero Rubino. Yes, certainly over time there was a problem of capacity constraint, meaning that the increasing demand was not met with a sufficient increase in the supply in terms of solving disputes. So there was an increasing accumulation of what we call pending cases over time in any area of the country, more in the south than in the north. Well, difficult to attribute it to different aspects of a production function, of course. We claim that the number of judges was probably not one of the main sources, certainly not the amount of other human capital, meaning clerks, increased a lot over time. Now the problem might be slightly different, but also comparisons across countries show that probably they were not a problem. It's very difficult to talk about infrastructures. Yeah, we don't have really data. There are some data, but only at some point over time about the presence of people using typewriters and so on, but that's very hard to use. So we have to consider it, but we don't have too much data on that. Thank you. Giulia.
A very short point. Also for me, all the comments were really useful. And I was wondering, also starting from Piero's question, how can we approach the problem of the length of administrative procedure from the point of view of the demand impulse? Because we could ask if the length of administrative procedure is the effect of a growing demand for administrative practices or administrative decisions, and in which way the regulation of economic activities increases the demand for administrative procedures and decisions, and in this way we cannot succeed in solving the problem, in reducing times and in increasing the capacity of the administration to give responses to citizens. The problem is that we don't have a data set for the administrative procedures as we have for the judiciary, because they were never collected and there are not documents based on that. So what would be very important is if we had the chance of building a data set, at least for the recent years or for some specific sectors, and even if those data are not comparable with the ones we have in the civil procedure, we could have some interesting outcome, according to me.
Thank you.